If you're looking for an antivirus that magically boosts gaming performance, you're looking for the wrong thing. No antivirus is going to increase your FPS. At best, some security solutions simply introduce less overhead than Windows Defender while still offering additional protection features. So instead of relying on marketing claims or synthetic tests, I decided to benchmark McAfee in real games using CapFrameX, frame time analysis, and repeated test passes. The goal wasn't just average FPS. I wanted to measure real-world smoothness, lower percentile frame rates, frame pacing consistency, and overall gaming responsiveness with McAfee enabled versus disabled. And honestly, some of the results were more interesting than I expected. Before looking at the results, let's quickly go over the testing process. The antivirus used throughout this benchmark was McAfee Total Protection. To avoid introducing unnecessary variables, only two features remained enabled during testing: the firewall and real-time protection. Everything else was disabled. Every game was tested twice. First with McAfee completely disabled, and then again with McAfee enabled. For each scenario, I performed 3 separate test passes and aggregated the results using CapFrameX. Outlier captures were discarded whenever frame pacing behavior looked clearly abnormal. Another important detail: all baseline tests were completed before installing McAfee. After that, the system was restarted and the antivirus was allowed to finish all initial background activity before benchmarking started, because testing immediately after installation can produce extremely misleading results. Let's analyze the results. Rainbow Six Siege produced some of the most repeatable and stable results during the entire testing process. Because Siege runs at extremely high frame rates on competitive settings, even small amounts of background CPU overhead become easier to detect. Despite that, McAfee introduced surprisingly little measurable impact overall. After aggregating all 6 test passes, average FPS remained extremely close between McAfee enabled and disabled. Frame pacing also stayed relatively consistent throughout the benchmark sequence. Lower percentile metrics showed only small variations, and none of the differences observed during testing were large enough to meaningfully affect gameplay responsiveness or competitive play. This was another strong reminder that proper methodology matters far more than random screenshots of FPS counters posted online. Without repeated testing and aggregation, small fluctuations can easily appear much larger than they really are.
Estaré aquí toda la noche.
¡Hey! ¡Cuidado, niños!
Shadow of the Tomb Raider ended up producing one of the cleanest and most consistent results in the entire testing lineup. After aggregating all 6 benchmark runs using CapFrameX, the final data showed virtually no meaningful difference between McAfee enabled and disabled. Average FPS remained almost identical across both scenarios, while lower percentile frame rates also stayed extremely close. Interestingly, McAfee enabled even produced slightly higher 1% and 0.2% low FPS values in the final aggregate. However, the differences were small enough that they should not be interpreted as a real-world gaming advantage. This was also one of the clearest examples of why repeated testing matters. Some earlier captures initially suggested noticeable frame pacing inconsistencies, but after rerunning unstable passes and cleaning the dataset, the final results became significantly more reliable. In actual gameplay, the experience felt effectively identical between both scenarios. Forza Horizon 4 ended up being the most difficult title to benchmark, consistently throughout the entire testing process. Some early captures produced unstable percentile results, especially during heavier streaming sections, scene transitions, and high-speed traversal areas. Several runs behaved like obvious outliers and had to be discarded entirely before aggregation. After cleaning the dataset and rerunning unstable captures, the final aggregated results showed a small but measurable reduction in lower percentile frame rates with McAfee enabled. Average FPS itself remained relatively close between both scenarios. However, occasional frame pacing inconsistencies became noticeably easier to identify during traversal-heavy gameplay. And honestly, this game was probably the best example of why average FPS alone can be misleading. A game can maintain nearly identical average frame rates while still feeling slightly less smooth during actual gameplay. Most of the measurable impact here appeared in lower percentile metrics rather than raw average FPS itself. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided also did a very good job exposing CPU-side overhead and background interruptions caused by antivirus activity. The benchmark itself behaved relatively consistently across all 6 test passes, and average FPS differences between McAfee enabled and disabled remained fairly modest overall. However, lower percentile frame rates still revealed small changes in frame delivery consistency during heavier scenes and denser benchmark segments. The impact was not catastrophic, but it was measurable through frame time analysis and lower percentile metrics. And this is exactly where antivirus overhead tends to become visible in real-world gaming workloads. Like several of the other games tested here, Deus Ex reinforced the idea that average FPS alone rarely tells the full story. Even when overall frame rate appears stable, lower percentile frame rates can still reveal background interruptions, CPU scheduling overhead, and small inconsistencies in frame delivery. After testing multiple real games across 6 benchmark runs per title, 3 with McAfee disabled and 3 with McAfee enabled, the overall results ended up being far more nuanced than the typical antivirus destroys FPS narrative often seen online. In most scenarios, average FPS remained relatively close between both configurations. The biggest differences usually appeared in lower percentile frame rates, frame pacing consistency, and occasional frame time irregularities during heavier gameplay moments. And honestly, that's exactly why average FPS alone can be misleading. A game can maintain nearly identical averages while still feeling slightly less smooth during traversal-heavy scenes, asset streaming, or background interruptions caused by antivirus activity. Among all the games tested, Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Rainbow Six Siege showed extremely small differences overall, with gameplay remaining effectively identical in real-world use. Forza Horizon 4 exposed the largest measurable impact during lower percentile metrics, particularly during streaming-heavy sections and rapid traversal. Meanwhile, Deus Ex: Mankind Divided did a very good job highlighting how antivirus overhead tends to appear more clearly through frame time analysis rather than raw average FPS itself. So, technically yes, but the answer depends heavily on the game engine, workload, background activity, and how sensitive you are to frame pacing inconsistencies. For most users, the impact probably won't be dramatic enough to completely ruin the gaming experience. However, if your only goal is maximum competitive frame consistency with the absolute lowest possible overhead, Windows Defender still remains extremely difficult to beat simply because of how deeply integrated it is into Windows. That said, McAfee Total Protection also provides additional security features beyond Defender, including extra privacy and protection layers that some users may still find valuable outside gaming. At the end of the day, this benchmark showed something far more important than simple FPS averages. Proper methodology matters. Without repeated testing, outlier filtering, frame time analysis, and aggregated captures through CapFrameX, small random fluctuations can easily look much larger or much smaller than they really are. Thanks for watching. And until the next benchmark, may your frame times stay flat, and your ranked teammates finally use their microphones.